For 20 years, we've been creating innovation in the CX industry, and now we're seeking out brilliant new perspectives on CX you just won't find anywhere else. I'm Richard Owen. Welcome to the CX Iconoclast. In any successful industry, leaders must answer a pretty existential question. How do you evolve and adapt as the world around you changes? My guest, David Tudehope, CEO of Australia's Macquarie Telecommunications Group, looks to customers as the ultimate guide. Now, frankly, this is something of an unusual position in an industry that's known for poor customer experiences. I had met David at a conference where his perspective really stood out, so I was particularly interested in hearing about how his approach puts customers front and center in the business. David explained that Macquarie Telecom Group strives to be what he calls an un-telco. The company was founded just as the telecommunications market in Australia was deregulating, with the purpose of making a difference to underserved, overcharged telco markets in Australia. David has led Macquarie through some notable successes. Over the past decade, for example, the company's market capitalization has grown 10 times, driven by its profitability increasing 400%. Constant innovation has been key to this growth. From his perspective, Macquarie has entered new business areas and rebalanced its profit mix from 80% telco and 20% cloud a decade ago to really the inverse proportion today. Macquarie relies on three key ingredients for success: customer experience, delivered and enhanced through complete transparency, continuous product and service innovation, and an executive team that harnesses innovation. A few of David's points stood out to me. First of all, in this industry, as in others, companies that don't innovate may not be around in the next decade. He's very clear that the customer perspective is the most effective guide for innovation. A lot of companies do, from his perspective, pay lip service to the idea of customer experience, but Macquarie has been concrete and quite focused about its superior customer experience as a differentiator. David also credits measurement, key to aligning the company around the customer experience, and in some ways he expresses regret at not moving faster to get those clear company-wide metrics in place and drive the delivery of customer experience. I think you'll enjoy this somewhat unusual perspective on what is quite a fascinating industry. David, thanks for joining us today. We met in London at a telecommunications conference, and in of itself, sitting through a half dozen or so keynotes at a telecommunications conference can be a bit of a strain, I have to say. And I was watching many of the keynotes, and the theme that just repetitively everybody kept saying was, look at all this fantastic technology we've got. We've got, this new platform and that new platform, and, we're going to change the world with all these different technologies. And you came on stage and more or less said something completely different. Said more or less, look, at the end of the day, this is all about the customer. And what stood out at me was not only that you were the only telecommunications executive that wanted to talk about customers at all, but also I think, this fixation that many telecommunications companies seem to have on just the idea that everything is about products, and the customer's almost secondary. So that was how to kind of kick things off. And I'd love you to sort of recap your thoughts on that, because it was such a powerful statement when you made it.
Yeah, well, I probably won't be invited back next year, so I appreciate you remembering. It was look, I think that's certainly true to our company, but even though I've been in the industry nearly all my career, it's still the case today that the industry underserves and overcharges, and does right around the world. It's its own very special place of its own. In Australia, for example, it has twice the number of complaints to the telco ombudsman, twice as many as the banking industry ombudsman. So it's like twice as bad as the banking industry, which is pretty challenged in Australia. So we're kind of in our own special place. And I think as a result, a lot of the industry tries inherently to move away from things that are inconvenient truths, and to talk about things that, as technologists, we're excited about, but also it avoids a discussion of things that we're uncomfortable about. And that's really where part of my presentation went to, as well as the fact that fantastic session at the conference which was the challenge that look at how some tech companies are growing compared with telecom companies, and how can we bridge the gap was effectively his question to us all. So in that context, the customer experience piece, I think, fitted very nicely.
Yeah, I thought that was a very interesting tee up that, you know, the industry can be a little self-congratulatory, and yet if you look at the industry performance, it's not a good story fundamentally, you know, and the industry has been somewhat left behind by other parts of the technology stack, should we say. And that was, I think, a tee up for what you had to say. It reminded me of the CEO of Ryanair, who very famously accused other airline executives of being aerosexuals because they love airplanes, not customers. Now, I think that sort of resonated with this idea that industries lose sight of what the ultimate point of all this is. And do you feel that there is, you know, you've obviously focused a lot on this, and I thought that the assertion you were really making was, at the end of the day, this is one of the things that sets us apart in terms of performance as a business.
It is, and it's and because the delta is so large, the gap is so large between what we do and the rest of the industry, it really resonates with customers in our market, and I'm sure it would resonate with customers around the world if people took a similar path. I'd also add that having spent my whole career in the telecom sector, and our business has evolved, and you know, very much the headline of the conference, you may recall, was the making of the modern telecom. We have evolved enormously, and I think the challenge with any successful industry is how do you evolve, adapt as the world around you changes. And it's one of the things that drives people to work in the tech sector and often brings them back when they leave. In that kind of context, it is easy to get caught up in technology, and it is easy to be enthused about it, and I get enthused about technology as well, but it can sometimes blind you to the changing needs of the customers. And the question of how do you adapt a successful business? And while the business history books are littered with great companies that didn't adapt, the comment I made to that, you might recall at the end of my speech there at the conference, was, I don't know whether we'll see all the same companies in the room if we come back in 10 years. Certainly there'll be a lot less people in the room on the current trajectory. And the opportunity is there, like everyone can see how the tech sectors are changing and how their businesses could, and my view, should adapt. But on current rate of travel, I am not sure that the telecom sector will be the same sector in 10 years, and certainly won't employ as many people.
Yeah, I wonder whether the sector uniquely is cursed by its origination. You know, many of the telcos, especially in Europe where we met, were national carriers, and so they originated as monopolies, and to some extent got dragged into competitive markets over time as the importance of infrastructure in some ways got replaced by all kinds of layers of more advanced technology. And so they had to move from being the profit source being just literally connection to the profit source being an ability to sell much more sophisticated suites of product, whether it's consumer or business. And because of the legacy, the history of these companies, doesn't that present a really big challenge for them because they don't have that history of being born competitively like that?
Completely. And I think the former monopolists are, if you like, they're like the child you met at school that sort of it was going to inherit everything. In their case, they inherited the world, like every customer, the whole industry, and they're progressively in every market being losing that. But what comes with that is a certain arrogance, and also I think a natural go-to around regulatory protection. Now, of course, in many countries, governments are willing to still to cooperate. Surprisingly, you'd think that they'd pick their citizens and competition ahead of one company, but in many countries around the world that continues, and regulatory barriers to entry, regulatory protections, regulatory price settings will mean that these businesses are still there in 10 years. It's not a question of existence, it's a question of what will they be and how will they be less than what they are today. And that I think will always take away some of the urgency of change. But that's the monopolists. And much as I love talking about ex-monopolists, I'd also say there's obviously the rest of every country has another industry, other parts of the industry as well, which are the challengers who've come up sometime over the last 30 years.
Right.
And I think the challenge for them, as much as the monopolist, is while they will enjoy, no doubt, some of those regulatory protections, they surely would need to rekindle their entrepreneurial spirit they would have originally had when they were the former challenger telecom businesses, now well established, also have the same urgency to adapt and change. And I think my perspective is the only way you can really tell how to adapt and change is listening to the customer. And it's the customer that really gives you the insights, because they really talk to how their needs are changing and how other disruptive elements of the tech sector are doing things that were previously done by telecom companies like messaging and communication.
Yeah, that's a good segue into the conversation about how you do that in the business, because again, in your presentation, I think you made a very clear point, and forgive me for paraphrasing here, but at some level, the emphasis to me seemed like you were focused on accountability and measurement. At the end of the day, as a leader of the business, you saw your job as being, look, let's focus the organization around what matters by putting in place metrics, by putting in place measurements, by holding people accountable, which, sounds very simple, but obviously you pulled it off within the culture of the business. Could you talk a bit more about what you did there and what you think really worked?
Yeah. One of the things that's been very powerful for our business is creating a single point of truth. And while our purpose has been the same for 30 years, about making a difference in markets that are underserved and overcharged, hence big focus on customer experience, the challenge for the first half of this period, nearly the best part of almost 20 years, was how do you measure it? And we did what everyone else did, which we had these big 50-question surveys. We'd do them twice a year. We would have someone dedicated to analysing them. We'd spend hours reviewing them as an executive team and below. And there was no lack of enthusiasm and commitment, because after all, it was our purpose. And we recognised the problem with the 50-question survey was that there were so many questions and so many answers that everyone found what they were looking for. So if you'd had a positive interaction the previous week, you found positive evidence of positive customer experience. If you had a negative interaction, you found evidence of negative interaction, you just reinforced your view. So it became self-reinforcing, and if you like, confirmation bias, and that doesn't work. And when Net Promoter Score was created over 10 years ago now, and we finally adopted that. One of my regrets was not doing it as fast as we should have, which was 2 years to actually put into place and replace the survey. But when we finally did, we had one question and one answer, then suddenly we had one truth. And out of the truth came insight, and it transformed our business. And I would add that idea of simplicity of measurement has been key to our success over the last decade, because we have managed over that period of time to just focus in on one measure of profit, one measure of growth, which is what we call net sales performance, and of course NPS. And so three measures are company-wide, the same measures that everyone's linked to, and their short-term bonuses linked to, mine included, right through to the reception.
So obviously there's an element here of just keep it simple, keep it extremely focused, but there also has to be accountability, right? At the end of the day, you said, I mean, financially you get tied to it at your level, which presumably means that you're able to, push that through the entire organization. And if you're going to measure just a few things, then at the end of the day, it's going to be backed up by accountability, right?
Absolutely. And one of our values is to spend life what that means. So is not doing your job. That's expected, and it's what's requested by the customers. But it's also it's going beyond that. And one of our great challenges when people join us from other organisations, not so much the initial beginning of their career, but mid-career, one of our challenges, they go, yep, I understand, it's just customer service, a different way. And the magic for us is how do we move it from people doing their job, being polite, being professional, to people taking accountability, following through, taking ownership, even though they could have someone else call back the customer to resolve the matter or to come back with the answer, they themselves do it. Simple but powerful things like that resonate with customers. And then the personal bit, giving a bit of themselves, that combination of personal and accountable is, we think, where the action's at and where the magic's at. And that is, without question, the part that we've had enormous success with customers on, and that flows through to the NPS results we've been achieving.
So the person, give a bit of yourself, that is unusual, right? I don't think I've heard people frame it that way. So why do you think that connects so much? Is it, because I can imagine that would translate across most cultures, right? At the end of the day, is it that it's convincing to the customer that at the end of the day, it gives them some confidence that the business is sincere in its approach, do you think?
I think what it does is that it's unexpected. It's the delight.
Yeah.
And and although in the industry we don't think of it, we in telecoms, a bit like in banking, are a little bit impersonal. You might know one person there or two or three or four, but you certainly as an organisation, we're seen as a bit impersonal. We're seen as built, being passed from person to person. And in that context, you don't expect telecom companies to say sorry. You don't expect telecom companies to call you back. We don't expect telecoms to be proactive about identifying faults before you do. You don't, and at an individual level, the personal touch is something you might associate with a smaller business or a neighbourhood business, but you do not associate with telecom. So when you do, so we find that it creates a sense of delight, and delight is what they remember long after they've forgotten the fact that you fixed the phone, or the internet's working, or the intermittent issue's been solved. That's just what's expected and requested. Now that doesn't mean you can't skip that out, of course, if you don't do it. And the analogy we use really well, Richard, seems to resonate with people, is doing your job professionally and politely is essential, and there's no substitute for that. It's like the sponge of a cake. The personal accountable service we've talked about, the accountability, the personal touch, giving a bit of you, that is the icing over the cake. Nobody wants to buy a plate of icing. If you haven't done your job, don't deliver the icing. But nobody wants to just buy a boring bit of sponge, right? Like I say, that you pass over that one. So it's the icing on top of the sponge is what makes the cake. It makes it so attractive and memorable. And then you put a happy birthday sign on top and a little ballerina, and suddenly, like this cake is now in the family photo album forever. And the corporate context is similarly powerful. Mm.
Yeah, I won't forget the cake story now. That's a good way of framing it. I mean, so that's got to percolate into your approach to hiring, though, right? Because at the end of the day, now you're asking people to fit in with a certain culture of the business, which is, as you say, perhaps a little bit different. And I think of companies in the past, you may not be that familiar with, companies like Rackspace, right? And Rackspace.
I know Rackspace very well. Yeah.
Right. And so Rackspace, and I think certainly in its golden era of growth, when it went from being an almost nobody in the early 2000s to being a very large business, talked about fanatical service. And I remember visiting their contact centers, and all they want to talk about was hiring profiles. And they had some very specific ideas about the personalities, the people they wanted to hire. A story that stuck in my mind sort of 20 years later was they liked people who could swear. They thought it was really important that you could actually use bad language if necessary, not on the phone with a customer, but internally it was part of their culture. They'd really thought through what kind of people would fit in their business. And it strikes me in some ways, if you're going to pull this off, and you've obviously been doing that, you've got to take great care about the individuals who join. Yeah,
completely. And look, I was like you, Richard, a huge fan of Rackspace through the 2000s. They're a business that we're very close to. We had lots of contact between us and them. We're also growing up together. An exciting business, obviously not the same business today. And in fact, all the people from that era have long gone, and their successes have gone, and it's like entirely different people and different business. And sadly, their fanatical service is no longer measured in a way that gets the same sort of results they used to. And it's actually a really great name. And of course, you probably know they're now sort of under a mountain of debt, so they've got like lots of pain, and they've been through a new CEO every year. So I say that out of sorrow, actually, because there was such a good business in the 2000s, the early 2010s. So they were just really good, and certainly one that we were very happy to compare to, and they compared to us. We had lots of great conversations. So from our perspective, this is such a great place to be, the whole NPS customer experience. We spent a lot of time thinking about hiring profiles as a result of all that era as well. One of our really important areas of focus is looking for people that are not just technically sophisticated, which is, we typically hire out of STEM degrees, but people who have a genuine customer service gene. And our view is that, which is different to others, you can't teach empathy. You can't teach a sense of customer service and delight around serving people. You either got that or you don't, and we have ways of drawing out whether you are both technically savvy as well as you have that customer service gene inside you, or just that, not even customer, just family service gene. I mean, one of the questions we ask about is, who would your family members call? Because someone who's maybe 21, straight out of university, they might not have worked before, or if they have, it was sort of completely unrelated type work. Who do your family call when there's a laptop issue? And we've all got people in our family we call. We've also got people in our family who we know would be so good to fix our laptop issue, but you sort of dread calling them because they make you feel like about an inch big at the end of the experience, because they even if it's something, something simple, you feel like a fraction of an inch, but even if it's something a bit more complicated, they still make you feel an inch big. So we've all got those people, but we don't want to hire them. We want to hire the ones where at the end of it they say, Richard, look, it happens all the time. This is one of the common glitches with this software, or this reminds me of the time where one of my classmates in my computer science degree had the same challenge, and you suddenly you feel your own height again. And they're the people we're looking to hire, because our customers are the same, even though our customers are, for the most part, we're IT specialists, and there's always things we find that they don't, and it's how you tell them something that's sometimes a very simple mistake on the customer side, and how do you tell them that nicely? Our stats are that way more than half the time an issue is caused by the customer's own error, and it's us basically telling them they've made a mistake somewhere along the way.
Yeah, it's respect, right? At the end of the day, I remember when I was in the PC industry, of course, we had the same problem, which was vast majority of technical support calls you'd get were, there's a reason why the joke was you just Control Alt Delete or literally cycle the computer and the problem sorts itself. These are complex products which even smart people are going to get into difficulty with, and so as a vendor, if you're going to deliver, you have to, at the end of the day, show respect to the customer, because it's not their job to be expert in your product or service, right? You don't expect them to be. And so, you've got to accommodate that. And it seems like that's sort of at the heart of the way in which you think about communication.
Yeah, completely. Just another simple example with our SD-WAN product. We've done an analysis of the fault calls, and just over half the fault calls are caused by customers not having their SD-WAN or router, if you like, device turned on. And you go, how could an IT professional not know it's turned on? And the answer is it's often in a branch office. The IT guy's in the central office or at home. And number one, a standard question is you sure that is the device powered on? They always say yes. Sometimes quite a frustrated sort of way that how dare we ask such a simple question? Half the time, when we finally track it, the branch office has the cleaner has pulled the PowerPoint out, or they kicked the PowerPoint under something, or they took it out temporarily and they haven't put it back on again. So how do you say that to a customer? The answer is you need people who just inherently find a way to say it in a nice way, even if on the first phone call the customer might have been irritated by us asking that question.
One of the things I learned, actually attending customer meetings back in the day in the telecommunications space, was delivering great service and support is a requirement. But to some extent, it's also a hygiene factor at the end of the day, right? You've got to do it, and it's terrific if you execute it really well, but customers don't want to be there in the first place. And as I understand it, I mean, you guys have looked comprehensively across the entire customer experience, right? And at least what we understood was you do have a knack of focusing on a few things that really matter across the entire value chain of the customer, right? Which I think at the end of the day, the secret to success is figuring out what are the few things that matter and focusing on making sure that those few things are correctly calibrated, right? Is that a fair way of expressing your approach?
Yes. So that was definitely where we started the journey. And I think for a lot of organizations, the whole customer experience Net Promoter Score process is quite daunting. They've got big businesses, complex businesses. You go, where do you start? Where do you finish? You've probably got different measures in different departments. You've inherited from somewhere, or the leader of that area has brought them with them from their last company. And you're trying to have a one measure across the business. And the way we approached it was to identify what were the key touch points in a customer's life cycle with us. We identified 8 of them. When we first started the journey over 10 years ago, we recognized we couldn't do 8 at once. So we started with the contact center. And there's probably been a lot of our external conversations been around the contact center because everyone gets it. And we chose the contact center because they're operations people. And operations people do what we ask them to do. And they make it as part of their process, and they do it every time, not just when they feel like it. And that was definitely the right call to make. And they really operationalized the customer experience measurement for us. But that addressed a couple of the touch points. We still had more to go, so we've had to inject it elsewhere in the business. That's more of a work in progress because you constantly got to watch people to make sure they do survey. They don't. Some of these areas, like say the people that deal with customers aren't as process orientated, so you've really got to be on their case, particularly around the fast feedback loop to make sure they call customer within the 24 hours we prescribe after they get a detractor or a passive response. So there's definitely you've got to be on it. But that 8 key touch points with measuring all 8 of them by the end of the journey has been really critical. And we try to make sure the contact with the customer is meaningful, which in Net Promoter Score terms is called the episode, but everyone else calls it the completed transaction. So we look for completed transactions, not just interactions. So we don't measure someone ringing up, say, looking to check their password or change their password. We measure the delivery of a project or a delivery of a service.
I think this is one of the things. My observation is that one of the things that's the heart of what you guys are doing, which is critical and often misunderstood by businesses. At the end of the day, 8. I mean, you said yourself, 8, even for a mature business like yours, is a lot to manage. And yet, the reality is almost every business can explain its customer experience outcomes in somewhere, and I'm going to guess between 5 and 10 things, right? There are 5 or 10 things which sort of dominate the equation in the mind of the customer. If you can get those right, if you can focus on them, you're going to have pretty good outcomes. And I think companies tend to veer in one of 2 directions. They either tend to make things overly complicated because they can't figure out what the 8 things are, or they sort of self decide. They think, well, these are the 8 things we'd like it to be, rather than what our customers think is important. These are the things that we think are important. And so they focus on the wrong measures. They miscalibrate. They say, well, we're executing at this level, and we think 10% better than that would be absolutely fantastic, when the customer is expecting a lot better. And so it's about, I think that you went through that quite quickly, but this idea of selecting the things that really matter, focusing the organization on them, calibrating them correctly, That's a big part at the end of the day of what management does, right? I mean, a lot of it is deciding where you want to point the organization, and then let's face it, we're sort of hoping that the organization rolls in behind that and goes and executes. But that selection is critical. So, you guys must have spent some time really thinking through what it was that you were going to focus on, because that's the big decision here.
It is. So I think a lot of effort was put into picking the 8, because there could have been, just to your point, there could have been 18 very easily. Indeed, in the long list, there were way more than 8. So 8 was the number. The challenge with some of them was working out how to measure them, and then the challenge also with some of them was there was a cultural reluctance to embrace them. So maybe just to give you an example, so one of the ones things we measure on our customer corridor was pay, the customer paying their invoice, and that's for us a finance function. It's collecting invoices, and any inquiries and disputes in relation to those invoices. And culturally, the finance people were very uncomfortable with this. I mean, I don't think you understand. We're in finance. We don't do service. We're definitely not in the contact center. This isn't going to happen. And then we finally said, well, it is going to happen. So it happened. And then the scores were really bad. And they're like, well, we could have told you that. We are downstream from everybody else. All the upstream issues just flow down to us. What can we do about it? We're just hapless passengers on this ship. And it took probably 2 years to get them to embrace that they were responsible for the customer experience, and there were things they could do that had a massive influence on the customer experience. And I'll just give you one example, which is so simple, but clearly wasn't being done originally, which is when you don't have an answer to a customer's billing inquiry or dispute, tell them you're still working on it. Because sometimes these things are complicated, and we've got some customers who are very technical, right, and sort of start really drilling down on things that aren't mainstream for us. And also we get questions where they haven't fully thought through their question, but we've got to go and think it through for them. And it just takes more than a couple of days, which our goal is to turn it around within a couple of days. And it's just coming back to them and saying, look, we're working on it. We hope to have resolution soon. It's like an aircraft that's waiting to take off for a long period of time. There's an issue with the plane. No one's quite sure what's wrong with it. You could just go silent and just let the passengers sit there for an hour, sort of stewing away, or you could say to the passengers, the engineers have arrived, they're looking into it, the engineers have sourced a part, they're bringing it from the warehouse. Just keeping them informed just gives them that sense that you're working on it, it hasn't gone to a black hole, and that makes a massive difference to the experience. And clearly the other one is the speed of response. So the faster we actually answer the question ultimately has a huge impact on them. Even if the answer is, the vast majority of the inquiries and disputes we get, the answer is Macquarie is correct, the bill's correct. How do you tell the customer that, after a few days of analysis, the bill's correct and they need to pay the full amount? There's a nice way to do it. If you do it quickly, you do it politely, then it has a big impact on the customer experience.
Well, I think this is a great place to sort of leave things, because I think you're leaving people with something that's deceptively simple as an idea, but hard to execute. I think this idea of getting an organization aligned end to end around a key series of metrics, getting the right metrics, and recognizing, by the way, and I think it's great to hear you talk about the challenge in getting functions behind this. And when you talk in terms of, look, it took us a couple of years to get there. I think sometimes people think that, number one, if it can't happen overnight, it's not worth doing. And the reality is these things take time. Secondly, they like to think that executives are omnipotent gods who can just wave a wand and the whole organization is going to fall in line. And the reality is we're trying to change attitudes in companies. That takes time, and you've got to be persistent with it. But at the end of the day, don't expect necessarily everyone's going to get behind it quickly. You look back in hindsight and say it worked really, really well. And so there's a lot to unpack in this story, and we really appreciate you sharing it. I think in the telecommunications space in particular, which I think is an industry, and you will end where you started, saying in Australia at least, you're kind of right there with banking in terms of, as an industry, in terms of popularity. It could have been worse, could have been lawyers, I suppose. But I think that it gives so much of an opportunity for companies like yourselves to go and be the different company, to be the company that actually does understand that this is about customers at the end of the day. And you capitalized on it. I think it's reflected in your results of business. So congratulations. Thank you again so very much. And especially for joining us from Australia, which is always a little challenging for time zones. So well done. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Richard.
Thanks for listening to the CX Iconoclast from OCX Cognition. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you won't miss any of our thought-provoking conversations. And please get in touch if you want to learn more about what OCX Cognition's predictive CX analytics platform can do for your business by providing complete insights into every account, continuously updated and connected to operations. You'll find contact info in the show notes.